Thanks to the success of my 1910 videos, which if you haven't seen, be sure to check out on my channel, I figured I could do my list and analyses of my top 10 of 1911, and then focus on the other planned video ideas later. But now, let's begin. My number 10 is If One Could See Into the Future, directed by Arrigo Frusta. This film is absolutely wild and is borderline mean-spirited with how it plays out. This did feel sort of like the earlier Trick films, but because of those aspects, it did make it seem less repetitive than all the early 20th century stuff that people will watch for doing their first deep dive. First off, Def looks incredibly silly in this. They could have easily used a hood to make him appear more menacing, but with his almost monk-like outfit and the scythe, he looks more like a farmer during colder weather. There's the way he knocks too. It's the slow yet heavy knocks, but he's barely touching the door if at all. But there's a reason for this. He could practically sneak into the house by pretending to be a stranger needing provisions, and while she's making something for him, he simply sneaks away, grabbing the baby. It is a silly yet great concept of the Green Reaper having to steal people he is taking to the afterlife. This leads to a journey to find the baby, of her asking for help for finding out where he is, and goes through a trek through some difficult areas. It did lead to an interesting shot. It seems like it's a construction site, yet despite that, it shows an icy mountain, and it reminded me a lot of those German iceberg films from the 20s called Berg films. It was always a cool aesthetic for me, and it fits well here with how dangerous her journey is. The set when we meet Death is incredibly surreal, and that alone frankly makes it worth watching. As someone who deals with death, time is of the utmost importance, which leads to the set having tons of grandfather clocks and even an hourglass one. For some reason, his sort of servants are kids as well to add to the overall surrealism. It then gets completely baffling. Usually, the trope of these stories are what will happen if you've never existed? This version is what will happen if your kid does grow up? And basically, he's evil and his life is short lived. It's mostly the underwhelming tableau setups, yet the scenes are short, and the overall message that these scenes provide is something I never thought I would see in a film this early. Finally, it ends with the realization that his life will now end. A shot that looks like daggers piercing her and then changing into flowers. The pain of his death turning into grief for her. It's hard to tell exactly what I think of it, to what extent I do like it, find it so bad it's good, or just straight up weird. But I think all of this leads to a really compelling film and is worthy of being on this list. My number 9 is Tilly's Party, directed by Lewin Fitzhammond. This is probably the most basic of the bunch, and perhaps maybe even grating to some. But I see this as an incredibly interesting film through its historical standpoint. It's basically shitty teens acting like shitty teens. On one sense, it's impressive the amount of chaos they would add to comedies from this era. All of the furniture collapsing and adults being impatient, yet trying to keep their composure over everything. But you always hear later generations saying this one statement, and this film shows otherwise. You know that statement, oh, this generation is awful for doing these things. You know, the thing that everyone older says. Well, yeah, some Zoomers are annoying now, but look right here. Here's younger Edwardians and the silent generations doing very similar things when they were young. No matter what, teens are teens. You don't have to tolerate that. Hell, I'm growing less tolerant of them as I get older, but it's simply an age thing, and I think this film shows it well in that regard. My number 8 is The Blacksmith's Love, directed by Francis Boggs. This is somewhat something that D.W. Griffith would make, yet I found myself more invested into this because of how much more of a downer it is. It's true melodrama. It follows two friends going to civil war and how abandonment can lead to a terrible situation. And I'm not talking about abandoning the war itself. Early on, it does start with some great landscape shots that help me find this film to be compelling. There's a fork of two roads turning into one, and they find a way to make the shot busy enough to not make it completely barren with just the main characters, but not to make it completely overwhelming to the point that it overshadows them. These are people leaving for war all at once, so there has to be the handful coming out of the camera. The heights of the two guys walking through right in front of the screen was a nice touch for me. Having the two forked roads joining into one gives an interesting perspective because of that. These are people leaving their homes to become soldiers of war. As the fork is joining together, That means the individual is gone and they are joining as one single force. It leads to an interesting point of discussion because of this. As one of them was abandoned by his friend for assuming he is dead, and frankly, the hospital was thinking that first as well, it leads to the ultimate mistake of the friend sending a letter towards his wife. Of course, life eventually gets better for the mourning family, and the friend gets more involved with her. This was especially because the other guy got mentally ill during the healing process and needed to spend some time in the asylum. Upon getting better, he comes back, sees a for rent sign on his place, and tries to go back to his wife. And now she's together with his friend. Both of them, of course, lose it, only this time, the one that survived the war unscathed is now the mentally ill one, which shows during a great scene of him doing the 1,000 yard stare. I assume the takeaway of this is to ask if this is the friend's fault for writing the letter to the friend's wife too early, also for abandoning him in the first place. However, the hospital seemed to have thought of the same thing beforehand. Is he really at fault for thinking this? Or perhaps it's just a societal part of how medicine was during the time, and it led to this sort of accidents instead, especially when they could have just sent letters themselves to update the wife on the situation with the asylum. There's also its intended moral message of how insanity got into the soldiers of war through multiple perspectives. This gave me a lot of food for thought, which, although isn't the best I've seen in regards to this era for films about discussion, this one stood out for me because of it being more grim than usual. My number 7 is Burgos, directed by Giuseppe De Lugoro and Segundo de Homon. To no one's surprise, if they watch my 1910 video, yeah, of course I was going to include a travelogue film. This time is a province of Burgos in Spain and focuses more on the landmark based buildings, which I assume a decent amount are still maintained to this day. It can get borderline surreal at times to reach this point of the past, but being able to get some sort of escapism by seeing it as a film rather than something like a painted postcard. The opening shot is people going down a hill with a donkey, but there's the stunning framing of two buildings that balance the shot extremely well, which includes what I believe to be the famous Burgos Cathedral. There's also people going through gates, showing all the carriages being placed in a disorganized manner, yet the shot still frames it with the buildings extremely well. It gave this great sense of contrast with man versus architecture. My favorite shot is a road showing the middle of the cathedral in all of its beauty, right at the center of the frame, balanced out by the two rows of buildings. It surprisingly ends with nature, which also gives a nice contrast. First are all the buildings, then man versus buildings, and then man versus nature. Like the buildings, the nature was in control because they were parks, completely organized, but they still had its own sense of beauty to it. On top of that, everything here is stenciled, so it has that old school type of color, which was the perfect final touch for me. There are better travelogues in both the previous year and the next few years for me, but this was still worthy enough to get on my list. My number 6 is The Roman Orgy, directed by Louis Fioulad. This director is known for doing the famous serials The Vampires, Fantomas, and Judex. And it's interesting to see him do something both shorter and done in an entirely new setting. Firstly, that's two entries in a row now with stencils. In this case, some shots have it used for costumes. I love it when they use it for period pieces, so this was perfect for me. It covers the Emperor Heliogabalus, who is a real emperor known for his incredibly hedonistic lifestyle. This is shown throughout the film by doing the usual trope of the grape feeding sort of thing, or having the servant doing a mistake and the whole get rid of him, feed them to the lions. There's not much to say to technical aspects, unfortunately, but the aesthetic of the film is great. However, there's one reason this rules: lions. They actually have lions there to imply that a servant gets eaten by them, but then they actually get loose and are doing the usual feline thing of being mischievous. I was giddy for joy while seeing this, despite this taking up around half of the film. Honestly, if you like lions, just see this, I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. My choice for number 5 is Pinocchio by Giulio Atamato. That's good timing because of Pinocchio Unstrung coming out recently, which I can't wait to see, but I digress. Right at the intro, it goes for a pretty cool idea. The actor changing into Pinocchio is on the stage, letting you know that you're about to see a feature presentation with some tableaus, which kinda gives it a play sort of feel. The birth of Pinocchio was a fantastic start, with the actor literally standing inside that block of wood. The overall looniness occurs early on and is quite familiar to the previous entry, Tilly's Party. However, this stands out even more by how vast it was. There's, of course, the great scenes where he destroys all the towns, showing his overall zaniness. It's classic Pinocchio. But the gags in this are some of the better ones I've seen in films this early. For example, he has to warm his feet near a fireplace, but he's made of wood, so they catch on fire. Geppetto literally saws his feet off afterwards and replaces them. That alone shows not only how funny this is, but how nightmarish this can be, and how this entry still stands out. For example, he gets lynched, or there are people wearing creepy animal masks. Again, there's not much here through a technical perspective, and I noticed some of the framing was kind of off, like with some of the actors, but I'll give it some slack because the costumes are fantastic during those scenes, and this was an overall nightmarish yet entertaining experience. Honestly, it's kind of to the point that this might even satisfy people with more modern taste for films. My number four is The Maid at the Helm, directed by Francis Boggs. For 1910, I talked about The Oval Portrait being an early example of a psychological drama. Although this one isn't as mind blowing, it still has a refreshing take of a psychological thriller, thanks to its use of an isolating location of the sea. There are three people who are in a makeshift boat and they end up being rescued. They consist of the captain, his daughter, and a mate. The opening shot are in bigger boats that happen to stumble upon the makeshift boat, and it's fairly well done. There's a crewman on the left side of the screen looking towards the boat in the sea. It's a simple way of showing how vast the sea really is and all the sights for him to take in. Of course, when you see the monotony of the sea, that makes you realize how easily a makeshift boat could stand out from all of this. The other impressive aspect are the zoomed in shots where you could see just how much the water causes the boat to sift back and forth, and how much that affected the camera they were using. Fortunately, it's at the point where it's so extreme it didn't really affect me in a bad way, like some of the Kodo films are when he uses it. Due to the exposure they had to go through, and their hope of being rescued diminishing more and more, the mate Bill experiences extreme jealousy with almost any sign of someone interacting with the daughter. As we are placed above this, basically the camera is looking down towards the action in some shots. It helps to have us establish a sort of dominance over the ship. Basically, Bill doesn't really have control because he's lower in the camera angle. There's a part where he jumps overboard to try to steal the ship for himself. He actually ends up doing this, and they show this brilliantly by having a shot that is all black except for a white background, with Bill climbing up a chain. As he is now above the camera, that meant that he's the one in control of the ship. He has established dominance. It manages to take that thrilling aspect well. How will they retake the ship? And what will they do with the daughter Elizabeth? Will she use any of her skills to assist them in regaining control of the ship? Although I wouldn't call this nail biting by today's standards, it's still extremely well done. My number three is Dante's Inferno, directed by Giuseppe Del Lugoro, Francesco Bertolini, and Adolfo Padovan. Well, it was bound to happen eventually, a classic making the top 10. This felt like an odd mix of the past of cinema of the time while showing some modernization of set techniques. It wasn't experimental in the sense of breaking new ground completely, but the simple, vast quality of this is just fantastic. Basically, this is a sort of epic and grim Méliès film. Each circle of hell is a giant one of his film sets using various editing tricks, and honestly is at the amount where I will call this the classical genre trick film. It can come down to someone holding their own decapitated head, or the simple use of this sort of angel with fans using around to make a halo. The array of tricks they use is so vast you'll always stare at them in awe and ask, how did they do that? Or even better, see how they've done it yourself, such as someone holding the head wearing an all black mask to hide their own face. There can be two big flaws of this, though. There is an overabundance of intertitle cards, and a lot of them consist of two people gawking at the circle of hell they're in, and realizing what evils they are seeing right now. It's the they should have sent a poet sort of joke. Still, I think it's needed for a film like this. With such a large mixture of sets that are already large to begin with, the amount of ambition that went into this film for 1911 is just ridiculous. Because of this, and the fact that movies are still kind of a new medium during this time, they had to settle for a quote unquote way to bring some sanity to the viewer. Give them the explanations with the intertitles and give them the human element of the people gawking on the chaos that's going on around them. Even though I consider those to be flaws to an extent, I still absolutely love this, and I think this is one of the essentials of the obvious classics of the 1910s. My number 2 is Austin Flood, directed by Ned Thanhauser. This is the version created by the NYU and is complete with a modern intro sort of setup to show the historical background of this. Basically, think of this as one of the first major news pieces in terms of disasters. A dam broke in Austin, Pennsylvania, and it completely destroyed a town of 2,000 people, killing 78. This is a depressing film, but one that shows an important outlook and why we shouldn't take for granted the resources we have. With something like this, they had cheaper houses, less shelters and ways to evacuate, and well, you could see enough from the film footage itself. The opening shot is quite fantastic, especially with its 360-degree rotation, and it says enough. There is literally no town left. Practically all of it is destroyed. But even during this, they show some more positive aspects. It shows the heroines Lena Binkley and Catherine Lyons, who use the switchboard during the disaster to give out as many warnings as they can, and that they were able to use some resources to both give and receive to help restore the town. After some rebuilding, they were able to bring steam trains to get the wood, and that's basically how they were able to start fixing things. This film makes you think of not only what differences we have in terms of societal aspects for disasters, but also what are similar, like the children looking for their parents amongst the rubble of their homes, or the refugees. This film is some really heavy stuff, but it's shot well, and it got me thinking a lot of how to deal with disasters in every aspect. I found myself quite impressed with this. And finally, my number 1 is Animated Putty, directed by Walter R. Booth. I call this one of the first purely experimental films of this decade, with last year having some experimental techniques in Santa Lucia. This feels a lot like a stop motion animated film you'd see from the 50s that was funded by the Canadian Film Board. You know, kind of like the Norman McLaren sort of stuff. But there's a sort of fantastical element to this. For example, you see the construction of the clay models in stop motion, not through the use of hands or just a step by step change into the models themselves. Instead, the clay moves around and forms into new shapes. It will flop out of a hole in a bucket and then morph around into a worm shape and then add itself onto something that is currently being constructed. There are a lot of different shapes in this, and because of all the different techniques that can be applied, every model is simply stunning. For example, the size of the windmill growing larger one rotation at a time, like that sense of a gravitational force that is extending it until it reaches the needed size. There is then one part that ends up doing some strange sort of opacity effect to two different models, one beautiful and one different, and it was very effective in an almost disturbing way. As this is only 4 minutes long, there's not much to this film thematically or through a theoretical standpoint, and there's not much I could say, but this is, I'd say, not at the Svank Major level, but the fact that this is made in 1911 just blows my mind. And that's my top 10 of 1911. There wasn't that much in terms of in depth discussions, but perhaps I just needed a year that aimed for more original ideas, and it looks like Italy had three of them. Still, I felt despite that, my top 10 showed my preferences quite well and hopefully was eclectic enough. My 1910 video was successful, which is why this one's done right after, but I'll take a break and work on other video ideas that have some variety. Still, I already have a top 10 ready for 1912 and 1913, so anytime I have that urge, I'll get right to it. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.